Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for coming this morning to this important panel titled The Importance and Possibilities of Establishing Weapons of Mass Destruction Free Zone in the Middle East. This panel is co-sponsored by the NGO Committee on Disarmament, Peace and Security, the NGO Working Group on Israel, Palestine, Peace Action, and Parliamentarians for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament. My name is Akira Kawasaki. It's a great pleasure to moderate this morning session. I'm from Japan-based NGO named Peace Boat, and working on various campaigns for nuclear disarmament. And I'm also from the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. So before introducing this morning's panelists, let me just say some very brief words about the background of today's topic. And as you know, creating a nuclear weapon-free and weapons of mass destruction-free zone in the Middle East have been one of the very important policy goal internationally. And at the United Nations, the General Assembly has unanimously endorsed the goal of creating a nuclear weapon-free zone by adopting consensus resolutions each year since 1970s. And in the context of the NPT, the 2010 NPT Review Conference adopted in its final document that the concrete process for creation of a Middle East zone free of nuclear weapons and all other weapons of mass destruction was agreed on. And in particular, the holding of the international conference towards that end was agreed to take place within 2012. And after that, as you know, the government of Finland took up the role of facilitating, and the facilitators, Ambassador Layava, is doing a really intensive work to achieve the holding of the international conference. And reportedly, it is scheduled sometime mid-December this year, but nothing official has been announced yet. And there are optimistic views or pessimistic views have been expressed regarding the holding of this conference within this year. And in parallel to that, there are various civil society initiatives to support and encourage such governmental process, both from in and out of the region. And my organization, Peace Boat, has been working on the project named Horizon 2012 by having regional and international experts and NGO people to get together on our educational boat, Peace Boat, and having track 2 dialogue to achieve this. And today, I prepared some summary report of the recent meeting of this project, so you can pick up later. And this kind of civil society initiative has been taking place in the various fields like Pugwash, BASIC, and many other groups like IKB Pax Christi have been working on that. And already Finnish group are preparing a civil society meeting in December to support this governmental process. So this morning, with this very important panelists from the region and internationally, we can discuss how we can support the process and what are the opportunities and the challenges to achieve this Middle East zone. And towards that end, let me introduce today's panelists from the right-hand side. So, Mr. Feiveson is a senior research scientist, a member of Princeton's program on science and global security of the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. And Hal had co-directed the program from its inception in 1974 until 2007. His principal research interests are in the fields of nuclear weapons and nuclear energy policy. He has taught a wide range of topics, including the environment, energy, and nuclear arms control. And before coming to Princeton, he was a member of Science Bureau of the U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency in 1960s. And next speaker, next to him is Mr. Peter Weiss, an international and human rights lawyer, and is the president of the Lawyers Committee on Nuclear Policy and co-president of IALANA, the International Association of Lawyers Against Nuclear Arms. He has spoken and written extensively on the immediate legal, moral, and common sense obligation to create a nuclear weapons-free world. And he's also a member of the Executive Committee of Americans for Peace Now, which supports the Peace Now movement in Israel, and the board of Palestine-Israel Journal. And then, next to him is Mr. Emad Kiyaei. Emad has worked closely as a researcher at Princeton with Ambassador Sayed Hossein Mousavian, a former Iranian negotiator in the P5 nuclear talks. He's also the executive director of American-Iranian Council, and a non-profit educational organization that focuses on US-Iran relations. Previously, Emad was an associate at the Center for International Conflict Resolution at Columbia University, focusing on the Middle East and Iranian affairs. And then, next to me is Mr. Hillel Schenker from Israel. He is a co-editor of Palestine-Israel Journal of Politics, Economic, and Culture. And in addition to serving for 30 years as an editor of Outlook Journal in the UN, and he has written for The Nation, Los Angeles Times, The Guardian, and the Haaretz, and the Jerusalem Post, and other journals. And he also coordinates the security group of the Conference on Security and Cooperation in the Middle East, SCMC. And next to him is Mr. Mian. He directs the project on peace and security in South Asia at Princeton University's program on science and global security, and teaches at Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. His research and teaching focus on nuclear weapons and nuclear energy policy, especially in Pakistan and India. And finally, Mr. Alyn Ware, who is the global coordinator of the Parliamentarians for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, and he has been doing the extensive efforts to promote this Middle East zone by initiating the Parliamentarians' joint statement to support this creation of Middle East zone. So with these panelists, we'll formulate the discussion in this kind of order. The first, Peter will be speaking about the context of the NPT and the Middle East zone idea in general. And then Alyn will be speaking about various efforts to promote the Middle East zone. And then we'll hear from Emad about the Iranian perspective, and then Hillel from Israeli perspective. And then we'll ask Hal to speak this issue in relation to the fissile material control in the region. And finally, we'll hear from Zia about implication to South Asia. So we want to have good discussions with participants. So I would like to each of the panelists to speak no longer than 10 minutes. So first, Peter, please.
want to welcome everybody to this event?
No, it's not on.
Is it on now?
Barely.
Closer.
Not on now.
Closer.
So you want me to yell? I'll try to yell. Now, am I on now?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I still want to welcome everybody to this event. I think you could call this a saturation panel. I hope we'll do all right by you. Yesterday, in looking at the by now rather extensive collection of literature that I have amassed on this subject over the last 40 or 50 years, I came across something I wrote in 1998, which I think would make a nice introduction to this panel. And it goes like this. Excuse my cold. There was a time, remember Dr. Strangelove? When the saner specimens of humanity believed that nuclear warriors were actually stark raving mad. And Lewis Mumford, a very great writer of that period, said the following. He said, "These madmen have a comet by the tail, but they think to prove their sanity by treating it as if it were a child's skyrocket." Not much has changed since 1998, and my assignment here is to tell you a little about the law of nuclear weapons, which is something that has tended to be dropped out of the discussion. And the reason it's dropped out of the discussion is because the nuclear warriors that Lewis Mumford was talking about don't want to hear about the law. And unfortunately, much of civil society has gone along with this exclusion. There's a wonderful quote from a book that Senator Patrick Moynihan wrote about 15 or 20 years ago, called The Law of Nations. And he said, in the annals of forgetfulness, there is nothing to match the disappearance of the law of nations from the American mind. At the time I wrote him a letter and I said, would you please introduce a resolution, a sense of Congress resolution, saying that whenever the president says that all options are on the table, he should add consistent with international law. But he never wrote back to me. Now, why is the law important? I submit to you that the reason it's important is because it is the one element of this discussion of nuclear weapons free worlds or nuclear weapons free Middle East that is not subject to debate. When people say deterrence is a sham, they will activate an equal number of people to come forward and explain why deterrence is necessary. And the same thing goes with the security people and with the Republicans who want to increase the defense budget and so forth. But I have yet to hear a cogent argument on against the illegality of nuclear weapons. So let me just tell you briefly where we are on that and why nuclear weapons are, in the words of the president of the International Court of Justice, which rendered its decision on nuclear weapons in 1996. He was speaking in French, and he said, nuclear weapons are le mal absolu, the absolute evil. People also think that nuclear weapons need to be outlawed. No such thing. Nuclear weapons have been illegal under principles of international law, which have been with us since Roman times, and more expressly since the 19th century. And they are briefly stated that the only legitimate purpose of weapons is to kill combatants. Agreed that there may be an occasional victim of so-called collateral damage, but those victims of collateral damage can't be in the millions. No, it can be in the dozens. So that's the basic principle. There are other principles involved here, such as when you're waging a war, you cannot damage adjacent neutral countries, a thing that is impossible with nuclear weapons. There is a principle that weapons of mass destruction, as such, weapons that kill not the occasional soldier or the occasional company, but large numbers at one time, are illegal. And there's a principle that, to the extent possible, weapons used in war have to be humane, which is very difficult to apply to nuclear weapons. So all of these principles were already in existence when some of us, including Alyn Ware and others who were here, took the case to the International Court of Justice. And how did we win that case? You might be interested to hear that because Alyn played a part in that. The International Court of Justice hears countries in alphabetical order. And it's a relatively known fact that particularly in a very long hearing, as was the case there, 2.5 weeks, the judges get a little tired, and maybe they perk up when the last lawyers come to the podium. Well, the last lawyers were going to be from the US and the UK. And so we were a little anxious about that. And I can tell you that Alyn spent the night before the final hearing with the delegate from Zimbabwe. And the delegate from Zimbabwe made a brilliant presentation the next day, which resulted, I think, in part in the now famous holding of the International Court of Justice that nuclear weapons are generally illegal under international law. That was by a very small majority of the court, but then also unanimously they held that there is an obligation, in parentheses, that means an obligation on all countries to negotiate in good faith and bring to a conclusion nuclear disarmament in all its aspects. So here you have, very briefly, the legal dimension. I'll say just one word, because I'm over my time, about the upcoming meeting, possibly upcoming meeting in Finland. I doubt that Israel will be there. If Israel is there, I think it will be only in a very minor observant position. I also think, and I'm going to make myself unpopular now, that there isn't the slightest possibility that Israel will give up its nuclear weapons until one of two things has happened. Either a Middle East-wide binding agreement among all the countries, binding and verifiable, to abolish and not to acquire all weapons of mass destruction. Or if you want to limit it to nuclear weapons, if ever there is a nuclear weapons convention, and every country in the world signs it and ratifies it, except Israel, I think at that point the pressure on Israel will be so heavy that they will not be able to resist it. Sorry to leave you on that pessimistic note, but that's my reading of Israeli politics.
Thank you very much, Peter. So, Alyn?
Thank you very much, and thank you to the NGO Committee on Disarmament and in particular for organising this event. I'm just going to speak for 5 minutes of my allocated time, and then I'm going to yield to PND coordinator for Arab countries, partly because I'm not from the region, and it's good to hear from someone from the region, from our network of PND, who's been working to engage parliamentarians in the region. And also because I agree with Peter, we are a bit of a saturation panel here. We're a bit saturated by males, and it'd be good to have another gender perspective. Our network of parliamentarians works on a range of nuclear weapon-free zones. The existing ones, to strengthen those and to get full recognition of the existing nuclear weapon-free zones by the nuclear weapon states, and also on proposals for additional nuclear weapon-free zones, such as in Northeast Asia, in the Middle East, and also in the Arctic, which are, I think, the three key proposals that are getting traction at the moment. We feel it's important for parliamentarians to be involved because they can play an influential role. Firstly, they are representatives of civil society voted to give voice to government. Some parliamentarians are in government parties and have positions that directly affect government policy. Some of our members are engaged in these issues and then get quite high-level positions, and Mona, my colleague, will mention one of those probably. Even if they're in opposition, parliamentarians can raise these issues, whether through the media, through public fora, or through the parliamentary process itself, through asking questions, holding debates in Parliament, asking questions of the Foreign Minister. So parliamentarians have a capacity to be able to raise the issues and help to move political momentum. In addition, they have a capacity to reach out across the borders of countries and to have dialogue with particularly parliamentarians, but also civil society representatives in other countries to help forge the cooperative approach which is going to be necessary to achieve nuclear weapon-free zones wherever they are. And that's why one of the tools that we use in PND is to forge joint parliamentary statements with parliamentarians from the different countries involved in the regions for nuclear weapon-free zones. So we have one, for example, for the Northeast Asian nuclear weapon-free zone with parliamentarians from Japan and South Korea cross partisan. When in 2010 the states parties to the NPT called, for the United Nations to convene a conference on a Middle East zone free of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. This seemed like an opportune time to elevate the role of parliamentarians in this process. And we were asked by the Arab Institute for Security Studies, which was taking a role, if we could draft a joint parliamentary statement. So we then did the consultation process to try and find a text which would be acceptable to parliamentarians from across the region. And I'm very thankful to some of the people here. Hillel, for example, helped us in drafting the statement, as did Sharon from Israel. We had some good help from the Egyptian Council of Foreign Affairs, for example, and the Arab League. And we had some good assistance from Sharia Kateri from Iran. That was very important. But we also looked at what was already agreed among states at in the international fora. So we modelled the draft parliamentary statement very much on the consensus UN resolution that's adopted, but also the IPU, the Inter-Parliamentary Union resolution that was adopted in 2009, which goes a little bit beyond the UN resolution, and that it also refers, and this is where I agree with Peter, it also refers to global nuclear disarmament, not just regional disarmament, and in particular supports the UN Secretary General's 5-point plan for nuclear disarmament. So after a lot of consultation, we released the joint parliamentary statement at our assembly, the PND Assembly in Bern, in October last year, and that we then circulated through the Inter-Parliamentary Union Assembly. It helps to implement the recommendations from the Inter-Parliamentary Union Resolution of 2009. And since then we've been circulating it to parliamentarians in the region, but not just in the region, because it's very important for the parliamentarians, the parliaments, and the governments in the region to feel the support for the process from other countries. So that statement is at the back. We've got it translated into many languages. I haven't put all the languages up there, but there's quite a lot of them there. We rely on civil society to help encourage their parliamentarians to sign the statement, so we welcome your assistance in that. We have the statement online also to make it easy to forward to parliamentarians. And we use the statement at various times. So, for example, we've made a presentation to the facilitator for the conference. We've made a presentation to the states parties to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. We'll look at also doing presentations at the Helsinki conference itself. One last thing is I was pleased that Peter brought up the International Court of Justice advisory opinion and the interesting process we had to ensure that we had the last word in the oral hearings. I think what's important also in that is to remember that we should focus not just on governments or official policies, but also on individuals and people. We can't write off a whole government. And in the case of Zimbabwe, for example, we all know there are human rights problems, with the president of Zimbabwe. But we were working very closely with the Attorney General, Nathan Chamurera, who was actually a student and a good friend of Peter Weiss's colleague Saul Mendelwitz, who set up the Lawyers' Committee on Nuclear Policy together. And with those personal relationships that have been built, we managed to bring in Zimbabwe at the last minute into the World Court case to give the clincher statement at the end. I think we can reflect on that also and not just write off a particular country because of the government's policy, but look at building relationships with people in those countries who we can work with, because sometimes they might just be able to deliver an incredible thing for their government that was totally unexpected. And the World Court case is one example. So with that, I'd like to pass over to Mona Mahamre, who's the coordinator of PND for Arab countries. She's just come here directly from the Parliamentary Assembly for the Mediterranean, where she was working with parliamentarians to advance the Middle East zone proposal. So Mona, I welcome you to the podium.
Thank you, my dear friend. Thank you all for listening to me. I came from the Parliamentarian Assembly in Mediterranean, And we had discussions with the PAM president there about the dangers of nuclear weapons and the importance of having a free zone in the Middle East, because in the Middle East now the situation is very critical. We are living under a very hard political and economical situation, and all of that is related to the threat of the nuclear weapons in the Middle East. For example, Iran now is in the process of developing weapons, and Israel having also 300 head of nuclear weapons. And we are in the middle as Arabs, and as being in the middle of this threat, we are not having the energy to do anything for that. So our work as PNND coordinators all over the world is to facilitate or to send the message to the world, to the Arab world and to the world in general, that it is very dangerous. Me, myself, I met with Hibakusha, the people who are the victims of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. I met with the nuclear test ban victims. I met with the Fukushima disaster, which is related to nuclear. And me, myself, I don't want to be exposed to any explosion. If Iran and the sensitive situation between Iran and Israel, if the tension was high and they are heading to use these weapons in the future, or the near future, on April, I think. So we tried our best to convince the parliamentarians in the Mediterranean Assembly to adopt a strategy, because they are working on different strategies related to unemployed and political security systems and environmental. So all of these things are related to nuclear free zones. If we have a nuclear free zone, all our problems will be solved, because your security will be sustained. We will have a sustainable development, either for the economy or for politics. And the PAM president, he said that they will adopt, and thanks to Mr. President, Mr. Tarauni, they will adopt a policy to start working with the parliamentarians in all the Mediterranean to have such a free zone in the Middle East. It is all initiatives, and it is not that the power that we have. People are, the parliamentarians are pessimistic because of the Israeli situation related to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, because until now they didn't show any interest in signing this convention. Until now they are not joining the Helsinki conference, and we are in the Middle East in a process of a new coming war if they are not interested in peace. So thank you for Alyn for giving me the floor, and thank you all for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Mona. So, Emad, please.
I'm going to attempt to see if we can do this over here. Good afternoon, good morning, everybody. It's always a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Anne, for organizing the event. As a typical Iranian, I'm between the Arabs and then followed by the Israelis, so it will be quite a challenge to follow suit. But I think that when we're looking at the distinguished guests here, and I feel really privileged because many of them are also I work very closely with. But I'm trying to give the Iranian perspective here, and I would like to start off by saying that if we want to look at the Iranian nuclear program, which has been under the spotlight since 2003, and there's a lot of media coverage and also efforts by Western powers to showcase the Iranian nuclear program as one that is pursuing nuclear weapons, and it seems like it's working. But I'm here today to also give you a background of what was the role of Iran in the initial efforts towards the creation of a nuclear weapons-free zone, which was proposed by the Iranians to the UN General Assembly in 1974. And to extend that, the Egyptians came along and they expanded this proposal, this resolution to be passed to include weapons of mass destruction. Once again, Iran supported that, and that was in 1990. So what is this future WMD-free zone in the Middle East supposed to look like, and what are we supposed to commit to? It is a commitment for all parties not to possess, acquire, test, manufacture, or use any nuclear, chemical, biological weapons, and also the means to deliver them. So the question is, does Iran want a nuclear weapon? And to reassure Mona that tomorrow we're not going to have a big war with Israelis, I would like to bring about a few points of why I believe Iran has showed that it is committed to not going the nuclear weapons route. Starting off, Iran today, as we speak, does not possess any type of weapons of mass destruction, including nuclear weapons. It is a signatory to multiple conventions that include Biological Weapons Convention, to Chemical Weapons Convention, to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and goes on to the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty that's also been signed to. Secondly, Iran is the only country since the Second World War that has been a victim of WMDs when it was used on its soldiers and civilians in the 1980s and 1988 Iraq-Iran war, where 100,000 Iranians lost their lives. So we have an understanding what it means to be inflicted with weapons of mass destruction. I'm sure my Japanese colleagues will also support that. So Iranians do not want this to happen again, not to themselves and not to the region. And that's why I believe this is one impetus for them to support a WMD-free zone in the region. Now, that is the Iranian side. Very nice. But what is the international community and what are the facts on the ground? Well, since 2003, the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, has implemented the most robust inspections in its history, with more than 100 unannounced visits and 4,000 man-day inspections in Iran. And to date, the agency has not shown any evidence that Iran has even diverted 1 gram of nuclear material towards a weaponized program. And if that's not even enough, well, even the American intelligence agencies, which is the National Intelligence Estimate, which is a collection of all of the intelligence agencies of the US, concluded in 2007 and 2011 that Iran does not possess nuclear weapons, is not on the verge of acquiring it, and has not made a decision, the political decision, to go ahead and build one. And I would like to end off the international consensus with Mohammad al-Baradei's statement, who was the Director General of the IAEA for 12 years and a Nobel Peace Prize winner, when he said, "I have not seen a shred of evidence that Iran has been weaponizing in terms of building nuclear weapons facilities and using enriched materials. I don't believe Iran is a clear and present danger. All I see is the hype about the threat posed by Iran." This is coming from Mohammad al-Baradei. Therefore, can we make the conclusion, or at least the effort, that Iran, by signing these conventions, by initiating the nuclear weapons free zone at the United Nations, and on top of it, even religiously obligating itself when the Iranian Supreme Leader passed a fatwa or a religious decree that forbids the production, use, and amassing of the weapons of mass destruction. Maybe there is a way for Iran not to be seen as an obstacle towards the WMD-free zone, but rather as a partner. And I would like to now look at what are the main obstacles that are blocking this initiative from moving forward. As Dr. Weiss and others have mentioned, it's been going on for decades and no movement has been going towards its realization. First and foremost, it is Israel. And simply because Israel is the only country in the region who's got nuclear weapons, weapons of mass destruction, is not a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and has constantly blocked any advancement of this initiative based on what Dr. Weiss once again has already mentioned, which is that they first require a comprehensive security arrangement and guarantees from regional countries before they will even consider talking about it. This is not the reality we are facing right now. Secondly, There are also complications within the region that range from the tensions between Iran and Israel, between the Iranians and the Persian Gulf countries, between the Israelis and the Arab countries. And also, it's all been intensified and made more complicated with the recent upheavals that we have seen through the Arab Spring and so forth, which has brought, in some areas, stability, in other areas, major instability for the future. And finally, there's also a huge militarization of the region. The United States, the biggest seller of weapons, conventional weapons, has provided $60 billion of weapons to Saudi Arabia, the biggest in US history just last year. So with all of this, is there hope? Are we going to be optimistic at all about the WMD free zone becoming a reality in our lifetime? And my optimistic answer is yes, and I have a few reasons for that. Firstly, the Israeli nuclear weapon monopoly in the region, for the first time, is under threat. And I'm not saying that the Iranians are going to build a weapon, but they have the breakout capability if they decide to go that route. So that already has changed the balance in the region. And it's created a combination of Israel's nuclear arsenal and Iran's breakout capability reinforces the need for us to move forward with the WMD free zone for the security of all, including Israel's. Secondly, the Israeli domestic opinion is also changing. And a recent poll conducted by the University of Maryland in 2011 concluded 2/3 of Israelis support a nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East. That's already a great indication that we can actually build the civil society movements and grassroots within Israel to support this initiative. So not all hope is lost with Israelis. And thirdly, the Arab Spring, as I've mentioned, has completely transformed the region in a very short time. It is driven by the youth of this region. More than 75% of the population of the Middle East are below the age of 35. They do not recall the wars of 1967 or 71 with the Israelis. They do not recall what was to be under the complete domination and of the Israelis. So I believe there is a movement that you can bring down dictators that have been supported by the West for decades. And what are we going to do about this energy? If this energy, we want to foster it, if we want to support it, then an initiative like WMD Free Zone in the Middle East can serve the stability, security, and advancement of development in the region by opening up much more funds towards social and economic initiatives that the youth of today and the changes that are happening in the region are demanding. So let us go with that, use this as an opportunity and not see it as an obstacle. But if we do not act, and if the West, the Israelis, the United States, does not change their political paradigm and understanding of the regional policies that have been applying without any changes in past decades, if they follow the same routes, very soon this energy that can be so constructive can turn destructive for all. So I hope that we do not make the same mistakes as before, and we use this opportunity in Finland to push forward as much as possible. Even though the Israelis are not there, our voice can be heard, even as we speak within their own communities. The change is happening, and it will not stop by the shores of Israel. So let's hope that that change transcends borders, and I hope that this brings you some understanding of Iran's initiative and Iran's willingness to move forward with the WMD free zone in the Middle East. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matt, for that very positive remarks. And the next one is Hillel. Schenker, please.
The Middle East is a very unstable place. Okay. Yes. First of all, I'd like to say hello. Yes, hello. Okay. I'd like to say to everybody, good morning, Boker Tov, and Sabach al Khir, which is how we greet everybody at the Palestine-Israel Journal in the 3 languages that we use. And 2 comments. One is that I think that what President Obama did better than the New York Yankees last night. And my second comment is that I agree with some of my predecessors that with great appreciation for all of the organization, particularly Anne, we should have more women here. And I would like to mention that in Israel, 2 of the prominent players in this area are women. First of all, the only head of an institute on arms control in Israel is Dr. Emily Landau, who is at the Institute for National Strategic Studies, and the founder and driving force of the regional disarmament movement in Israel is Sharon Dolev, who some of you know. So women are very active. Of course, Muna is here, and I'm sure we have other people, Cora, other people in the audience who could easily also be here on the panel. Now, not long ago, just a few weeks ago, we had, here he is, King Bibi, as he was dubbed, Time magazine, standing across the street, and he did this. He drew this imposing Tom and Jerry cartoon, which the bomb. Nobody quite understands exactly what it even means. Why is this 70% line there? None of the Israeli analysts understood that. And as a matter of fact, it was rather laughed at here. Yediot Achronot, the mass circulation daily, calls it Bibi Boom. And yet it's not a laughing matter. As we all know, as far as he's concerned, the idea of a weapons of mass destruction free zone simply isn't on the agenda. All he's interested in is preventing Iran from achieving nuclear weapons. And the fact is that this past summer, you should know that there was a general state of anxiety in Israel, in the Israeli public, because any day there was this feeling that Israel might attack the Iranian nuclear facility, and then there would be a response. There were all sorts of rumors about text messages being sent to soldiers to get ready. And the fact was that the general Israeli public was extremely anxious and actually relieved with this strange thing when he suddenly declared, well, actually, it's not, the deadline is not now, the deadline is the spring, etc. But the fact is that that's the reality within Israel. Now, he has used the Iranian issue to distract the Israeli people and body politic from dealing with all of the other issues that Israelis that are on the Israeli agenda, particularly the Israeli-Palestinian question, and also the socio-economic issues that were raised by the social protest movement. Now, the official Israeli government policy, despite all of this, is to support the eventual creation of a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. It's signed on, and each year it is actually stated by the Israeli delegate here. And they also insist that unlike all of the other existing nuclear weapon-free zones, they insist it should be WMD and not just nuclear, because that they are signed on to as an ITIR. The problem is that from the governmental perspective, this is an end of days scenario. In other words, only after a comprehensive weapons-free zone, a comprehensive peace in the Middle East, Israeli-Arab peace, will be arrived at, then we can negotiate a weapons of mass destruction free zone. Now, that was also the one serious attempt at moving forward on a regional basis was after the Madrid conference, when we had the ACRES talks from 1992 to 1995. And that broke down essentially because of the basic difference of opinion between the Israelis and the Egyptians at the time over what comes first, the chicken or the egg. Do we first have nuclear weapons-free zone in order to build confidence towards Israeli-Arab peace? Or do we first have Israeli-Arab peace and then we can achieve a nuclear weapons-free zone? And the last session was convened back in 1995 and it has never reconvened. Now, my view, which I've been advocated in a number of forums, is that the only way to get around and out of this bind is to create two parallel tracks. One track would create a roadmap to move forward towards a weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East, and the other parallel track would be moving forward at the same time towards comprehensive Israeli-Palestinian, Israeli-Arab peace. And we do not have an Egyptian on the panel today, but in discussions that I've had recently with Egyptians, they say that they understand the need for linkage and that they are no longer just saying that it's only one first and then the other. And the question is how to produce formulas, workable formulas, that will enable that parallel process to happen. And I believe that one of the most important tools that we have out there, which didn't exist at the time of the Acres talks and didn't exist at the time of Camp David 2000, is the Arab Peace Initiative, which was launched in 2002, which essentially says that the Arab world, and it was then signed on by the Muslim world, including Iran, that if Israel is ready to withdraw from the occupied territories and enable the establishment of a Palestinian state in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, and find an agreed-upon solution to the refugee problem and the Jerusalem problem, then the Arab world is ready to recognize Israel and have normal relations. They did not, in the API, the Arab Peace Initiative, mention the issue of weapons of mass destruction, but I think that it can be used as a tool to move forward, and I was very relieved to see that in Baghdad, after the Arab Spring had been in full flow, at the Baghdad Summit Conference of the Arab League, they reaffirmed support for the Arab Peace Initiative. So we have a tool which I think is very important to promote, and I would also hope that the Arab leaders today, because of the uncertainty that Israelis feel, not only the government, but also the people, about where the Arab states are vis-a-vis the Arab Peace Initiative today in the wake of the Arab Spring, I would hope that Arab spokespeople from the region, it would particularly help if it was Saudi Arabia, but definitely Egypt and Jordan as well, who are the official representatives to Israel, since they are the two countries who have a peace agreement. I would hope that they would speak directly to the Israeli public today and say the Arab Peace Initiative is still an historic opportunity for you to move forward, and we can all, those of us who are interested in a mass destruction weapons-free zone, can plug into that as part of the process. Now, the Helsinki conference, I believe it should, we know it's a governmental conference, but it's very important that there be a civil society parallel process taking place alongside the Helsinki conference. And essentially, to a great degree, it is happening, because there are many initiatives that have been in civil society initiatives which have been involved, which we as Israelis and Palestinians and people from the region have been involved. And just to mention a few, here's Akira and Mona, the Horizon 2012 initiative in association with the Japanese Peace Boat. Then there is the Academic Peace Orchestra. There is Dr. Kubik sitting there, who is the initiator of that process from the Frankfurt, the Peace Research Institute in Frankfurt, which has been holding many regional forums. In 1 month, I have been invited, as have some of my colleagues, I don't know if anyone else here has been invited, to an Athens dialogue. In other words, there are many players, and the United States people don't seem to be that, it's not so much on the agenda, but there are many players out there, particularly in the region and in Europe, who are actively involved. And then something else that was mentioned in the introduction, a very ambitious civil society conference on security and cooperation in the Middle East, whose initiative actually came out of Professor Mohsen Masarat, who was a German professor who grew up in Iran. IPPNW, Germany IPPNW was also involved, and we have people from the entire region, Iran, Israel, Egypt, Turkey, even Kuwait, Jordan, and Turkey. They were all there and are involved. Now, the bottom line, I'm leading towards my conclusion, is that Groucho Marx once said, I don't want to belong to any club that will accept me as a member. Now, contrary to that wisdom, the fact is that if we do not have Israel and Iran at the table, then we cannot make any progress at all. Now, there were reports, people all read and heard the presentation by Dr. Shaul Chorev, who is the head of the Israeli Atomic Energy Agency, at the meeting in Vienna. And it was interpreted in a lot of the reports as if the Israeli government had officially said it is not going to the Helsinki conference. And my reading is different. My reading is that what he did there is he simply reiterated the official position, which is first comes comprehensive peace, then we will be ready to be involved in initiatives. But it is not the final word from the Israeli government. And today, the next step, the next stage in the process is the outcome of the American elections on November 7th. So if President Obama is reelected, then I believe that we have a basis for further negotiations moving forward towards a conference which can hopefully be productive. I know the Finnish facilitators have said to the Israelis, we are ready to negotiate every aspect of the conference with you in terms of what will be the format, what will be the final outcome, so that you can be involved. If Obama is reelected, I believe we can move forward. If candidate Romney is elected, my reading is that the whole process will be frozen, at least for the foreseeable future. As was mentioned, as you mentioned, one very important element in terms of the Israeli society is the fact that the majority of the Israeli public, because of the anxieties they feel, are in favor of it. They say we would rather give up the Israeli nuclear weapon if that is what is necessary in order to prevent Iran from giving the weapon. This is what the polls said. And also a clear majority of the Israeli public is against a unilateral Israeli attack on the Iranian facilities, as are all of the current and former senior security officials within Israel. So here we are, and it's vitally important for all of the peoples in the Middle East to have this process move forward. It's really an existential situation for all of us, and the only final comment that I would like to make here is that this process has to be handled with care and sensitivity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hillel. So we heard three regional speakers, so we move on to hearing from the UK experts from the region. How to
well, let me also say thank you to the organizers and especially. Some folks have suggested that if we can't move quickly or even not quickly toward a Middle East weapons of mass destruction free zone, there may be steps along the way, sort of way stations that would help. For example, the parties might agree in sort of more formally than they have through more sort of global agreements on a chemical weapons convention, that they all sign up for it and have verification, biological weapons convention, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and so on. And so I wondered if it does make sense, and I'm not sure it does, to think of a phased approach that might include some agreement on a production-free zone for the production of fissile material, highly enriched uranium and plutonium. So I just want to throw out a few ideas, and as I said, I'm not really sure any of them really a good idea, but let me mention them. But before doing that, let me give some background, and the background might not be obvious for the moment until I get to my conclusion. The first thing is the United Arab Emirates, the UAE, and the so-called gold standard. The UAE is the first country in the Middle East, other than Iran, to acquire nuclear power. In 2009, the UAE and the U.S. Concluded a bilateral agreement that provided that the UAE, quote, shall not possess sensitive nuclear facilities within its territory relating to the enrichment or reprocessing of material. Enrich uranium to get, one way to get weapon-grade fissile material, and reprocessing separates out plutonium, which is another nuclear weapons material. The agreement also included a sort of a most favored nation treatment clause that provided that the conditions accepted by the UAE should be no less favorable than those which may be accorded to any other non-weapon state in the Middle East. So if another country in the Middle East getting nuclear power says we don't want to accept this notion that we're not going to reprocess, separate plutonium, and we're not going to enrich, then the UAE would not be obligated to do that. And Jordan already has objected to accepting restrictions such as in the UAE-US agreement that go beyond the NPT. So that's the first sort of background thing I wanted to mention. Now let me just quickly mention sort of our understanding of what is going on in Israel and Iran. Israel might have something like 800 kilograms of plutonium, enough for 100 to 150 or more nuclear weapons. It's possible that the Dimona reactor, which Israel has used to produce plutonium, is now operated primarily to produce not plutonium for weapons, but tritium. Tritium is probably, we don't know for sure, is probably used in at least some of the Israeli nuclear weapons to sort of boost the yield. And tritium has a half-life of about 12 years. So it has to be, if Israel is using tritium in their warheads, they have to be producing tritium to replace the tritium that's decaying. And Dimona could produce about 20 grams of tritium a year, which is, by sort of back-of-the-envelope calculations, maybe roughly the amount that Israel would want if they keep their nuclear arsenal. So even if Israel doesn't want to make any more plutonium, they may somehow still want to use Dimona to make tritium. So that's Israel. There's no evidence that Israel is doing any enrichment of uranium. Now Iran, as we know, is producing some enriched uranium at their Natanz facility, at their pilot facility at Natanz, and at their underground facility, the Fordo facility. And I have a bunch of numbers, but let me maybe not talk about the numbers. they have enough of, now they're enriching, most of the uranium is enriched to 3.5%, which is roughly what you would need to fuel a nuclear reactor. To get weapons, you need something like 90% uranium-235. They have enough of the 3.5% to, right now, if they rejigger their cascades, kick out the inspectors, and take many months to make from that 3.5% enriched uranium perhaps 4 to 6, something like that, nuclear weapons. At the pilot facility and at Fordo, the Iranians are also producing something called 19.7, uranium enriched to 19.75%, which is the enrichment they need to make fuel for their reactor, their research reactor. And they've made about 189 kilograms of this uranium, which is what the Israelis seem to be the most worried about. They've turned about half of that, though, into fuel or the prelude to fuel for their research reactor. So even though they could use it eventually, so the 189 kilograms is initially a uranium fluoride gas, which you use for enrichment. Half of that is no longer a gas, it's now into a powder form. And they could reverse that, but it would take time. So they have cumulative only about now 92 kilograms. This is based on the latest International Atomic Energy Agency report in August. They have about 92 kilograms. To make 1 or 2 warheads, they would need maybe something like 300 kilograms of this. So that's one reason I think that Netanyahu talked about, well, it's not now, it's next spring or whatever. Okay, so that's background. So now, does it make sense to think of some production-free, fissile material production-free schemes for the Middle East? So let me just mention 4 quickly. One is that the countries in the Middle East agreed for no uranium enrichment and no spent fuel reprocessing. That's the gold standard, UAE gold standard. Now the trouble with that is I already mentioned that Jordan, among other countries, Jordan's the one country in the Middle East that objected to that. Why should we accept restrictions that go beyond the Non-Proliferation Treaty? No other nuclear-free zone has such restrictions. And on the other hand, most countries with nuclear power don't have enrichment or reprocessing. So it's not a completely unreasonable thing to think about, but of course Iran is enriching. So they would be the ones immediately singled out by such a production-free agreement. So it's an obstacle. The second possibility is that the countries would agree, in the Middle East, the countries would agree to no enrichment over X percent. X could be 5%, roughly the most you would need for most reactors, or maybe over 20%. 20% is the limit. Over 20%, you could probably make a weapon, but it would have a really big critical mass, so you really need something like 90% to make a weapon, but 20% is sort of what the IAEA calls highly enriched uranium, sort of the breakdown of direct use material. Trouble with this is that if there's no reprocessing, it would require verification at Dimona, and the Israelis may be nervous about that, and they may not want to close Dimona. If they close Dimona, verification might not be too intrusive, But if they want to keep their MONA open to make tritium, the verification to make sure that they're making tritium but not plutonium could be very difficult. So that's a problem. The third possibility is countries agree to no enrichment over X percent, let's say 20%, and just silent on reprocessing. So that would leave out the MONA. But the problem there is that the only country that would be immediately affected would be Iran. So that's a problem. On the other hand, if every country now agrees they'll never ever enrich over 20% or 10%, 5%, that could be bargain. Then Iran might feel that then they're not being, even though they're immediately affected, they're not going to be singled out forever. It's sort of a more global or more regional restriction. And the fourth possibility is that the countries agree to no fissile material production of any kind for weapons. You can make enriched uranium for peaceful uses, but you can't make any fissile material for weapons. That is, everything you do is under international safeguards. Now, the NPT already requires this of all countries in the region except Israel, which hasn't signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So that's, again, maybe something that might make one pessimistic that could be part of a way station toward a more weapon of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East. But if has now been threatened to be negotiated in Geneva for many years, the nuclear weapon states all agreed to a fissile material production cutoff, then Israel could be part of that. And so the U.S., the Russians, French, Indians, Pakistanis, and so on, if they all agree, Chinese, on a fissile material production cutoff, then maybe Israel could join in that, and that could be part of a general Middle East agreement to no fissile material production for weapons. So I'm not sure what exactly one can conclude from this. My sense is that each of these production-free agreements that I mentioned have some attractions. If it's not an alternative, but a way station to a full nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East, or a weapon mass destruction-free zone in the Middle East, if the countries could agree on it. But there's real questions whether they could agree. And the two biggest, I think, are that will Israel be prepared to accept verification arrangements at the MONA? And will the countries of the Middle East more generally be willing to go beyond the restrictions on civilian nuclear power that go beyond the Non-Proliferation Treaty? So I'm not sure where I end up exactly, but some thoughts.
Thank you very much, Hal. So, final speaker from the panel will be Mian. So you have the floor.
Thanks, Akira. Thank you, everyone. It's not clear to me that I have much to add by way of...
Lift up the mic so it is closer to your face. Thank you.
But then it becomes intimidating because all I can see is this thing. Anyway, so let me make a couple of observations. The first follows up from what Feiveson just said. I think the issue is not an end to the production of nuclear weapons material by Israel and the Arab countries agreeing to not make nuclear weapons. The whole point of the Middle East nuclear weapons-free zone, as far as the Arab world has been concerned from the beginning, has been to denuclearize Israel. Right? It's about the actually existing nuclear weapons. See, that's what happens. I get a horrible hum. I'll just shout. It's about actually existing nuclear weapons. Right? And the existing stockpile of the material that has been accumulated to make those weapons and to make more. That was the reason for the timing of the original resolution, because by the early 1970s, everybody knew the Israelis had nuclear weapons. And the point was, what was the Arab world going to do after having been defeated in wars? Looking forward, they saw that we have lost conventional war. Now that Israel has nuclear weapons, we have no options going forward in military terms. So what do we do? So I don't think that's a trade that actually, will carry much conviction among many Arab countries. At the same time, one of the reasons that Israel has been able to resist a Middle East nuclear weapon-free zone for so long has been the fact that it wasn't clear for many years that the Arabs would ever actually have any real capability to do anything about it in terms of building their own countervailing capacity. Right? So what we've seen is that not very much happened in the 70s, except the Shah of Iran launched an ambitious nuclear program with American support, and he actually had nuclear weapons ambitions. Saddam Hussein had nuclear weapons ambitions. And then we learned that the Libyans bought enrichment, the Iranians bought enrichment, the Syrians tried to build a reactor with help from North Korea. And so suddenly in the last 10 to 15 years, what we have seen is that the reality on the ground about what is possible and what you need to take into account has changed fundamentally. And so that brings me back to a point that Emad made, that the old ways of thinking about this have actually been left behind by the reality of the ground. One continuity is the fact, and we haven't mentioned this, the single most important security player in the Middle East is neither Arab, Persian, nor Israeli. It's America. Okay? The possibility or non-possibility of a Middle East nuclear weapon-free zone hinges on the United States. It is the single most important determinant of security policy in Egypt, in Israel, in Saudi Arabia, in Iraq, in Syria, and in Iran. Right? For good or bad, depending on how it chooses those relationships, but it is what shapes the security calculus in all of those countries. It has made governments, kept governments, brought down governments, sold weapons, not sold weapons, imposed sanctions, lifted sanctions. So that's what actually shapes how these countries think. And in many ways, if you think about it, the bilateral relationships that these countries have with the United States are in some ways on security issues more important than the relationships they have with each other. Now, people tend to cloud the fact that most recently, under President Clinton, the United States actually signed a memo guaranteeing support and strengthening of Israel's deterrent capability. And what does that mean? In the same way that, as we now know, Germany, which sells submarines to Israel, has said, yeah, we knew they were putting nuclear weapons on. So, when we have all this talk about the Middle East zone, and we talk about the countries in the region, it actually misses the point. What happens in the region is overwhelmingly determined by the relationships between that region and the outside world. And we don't actually see very much of that in terms of what's going on with this conference. Okay? So let me bring in the other outside element, and that is South Asia. Now, for a long time, there was an idea of a South Asian nuclear weapon-free zone. Pakistan even proposed it when it didn't have nuclear weapons. But in Israel, India did. And the idea was that, just like Iran, with the Middle East, the Pakistani said, oh yeah, we want a South Asian nuclear weapon-free zone because it'll make their nuclear weapons go away. As soon as they got theirs, they stopped talking about it. Now nobody talks about it. But it is important that Pakistan has profound security interests and relationships with an increasing number of countries in the Middle East. Not only did it sell centrifuges to Iran, but they actually share a border. Right? And if the crisis in Iran continues and escalates, it will become a real problem for Pakistan to think about how it's going to deal with this. That you have a country on your border which historically you've had enormously good relationships with. You don't illegally sell centrifuge enrichment technology to somebody you're not actually feeling that you have the capacity to have a long-term, stable, strategic alliance with. Certainly not to somebody who may be a potential enemy. And in previous conflicts, domestic and international, Iran and Pakistan have actually helped each other. Pakistan, we know, has enormous interests in Saudi Arabia, and the Saudis have enormous interests in Pakistan. And one of the concerns that people have had is that if Iran does choose to acquire nuclear weapons, the Saudis may well decide that they want to exercise some option for themselves also. So very senior Saudi public figures have gone on record saying, yeah, we would do this. And the shortcut to a Saudi nuclear weapons program is Pakistan. Not that they just give over nuclear weapons, but the United States does. So, it's not unthinkable in the same way the United States puts its nuclear weapons in Turkey, Italy, Belgium, Holland. Actually used to have them in many other countries. Extended deterrence. Well, it can work for others too. But also there are lots of Pakistani nuclear weapon scientists looking for, a last good paycheck. And I'm sure the Saudis will be very generous. And so, there is a concern about how that relationship will play out. And as Hal mentioned, there is this question of the fissile material cutoff treaty. That one way to restrain at least the possible size of the nuclear arsenal in Israel, although it seems to have plateaued, and to make sure it's a belt and braces approach, that even though you've signed the NPT, then there's also this other FMCT that comes on top for non-weapon states, that countries would commit never to make the material for nuclear weapons, which, by the way, is not forbidden under the NPT. You're allowed to make highly enriched uranium under the NPT. You're allowed to separate plutonium under the NPT. As long as it's under safeguard, it's okay. But then you're also allowed to leave the NPT. So there are issues that come from that. And Pakistan has been blocking the negotiations in Geneva for its own reasons, which brings me back to the United States. The idea that Pakistan is single-handedly blocking the entire international community is laughable. In the same way that Israel is single-handedly blocking, the entire international community's demand for a Middle East nuclear weapon-free zone. Countries like this are not capable of withstanding the whole world unless people in power choose not to exercise that power. In the case of the FMCT in Pakistan, the United States has bigger interests than banning the production of fissile material for nuclear weapons right now. It's Afghanistan. Right? So as long as that continues, the United States will not worry about Pakistan blocking progress. As long as the United States has a certain set of interests in the Middle East and a set of political relationships, it's not going to make a Middle East nuclear weapon-free zone a sufficiently high priority to actually make it happen. To make countries make difficult choices. So I think, for me, the issue is twofold, and I'll stop there. One is that we have to stop thinking about this as a Middle Eastern problem. Right? It's not a Middle Eastern problem. It's not an Israeli problem. It's not an Arab problem. It's not an Iranian problem. This is actually a problem of the present international structure that we have, that that we've inherited after the Cold War, and a certain set of practices about what's important and who gets to decide where aircraft carriers go or don't go, who deserves to defend it, and what should the price of oil be, and who should set that price. And until we grapple with that fundamental underlying set of realities, we're not actually going to make much progress on this second-order issue like the Middle East nuclear weapon zone. The second is that the old way of thinking about this, which is in part about the Middle East and the relationships between these countries, is being undone as we speak very rapidly. And so it is not clear to me at all that the presumptions that the Middle East, as we've come to imagine it, right, will actually be a meaningful analytical category for much longer. Right? I think that relationships are actually breaking apart in all kinds of interesting ways. And so how, you know, President Morsi and others will see Egypt's interests, right? How a new Iraq will see its interests and its relationship with Iran, how Libya and Syria and so on will come out of their present crises and reimagine their relationships. It's not clear that that inward-looking legacy of pan-Arabism and let's gang up against the Israelis and, you know, etc., that this is going to hold for much longer. And so we should perhaps think about whether we're actually looking forward about where geopolitics is taking us, or whether we're actually stuck in a way of thinking about this that is now 30 years out of date.
So thank you very much, Thea. So now I'd like to open the discussion with the floor, and I think